Dawn crept over Willowmere like honey dripping from a spoon, slow and sweet, casting long shadows beneath the ancient willows that gave the settlement its name. In a round green door set into the hillside, a brass knob turned with practiced care, and out stepped Orlen Mossroot, already adjusting his worn straw hat against the morning sun. "Another fine day for mushrooms," he muttered, a habit born of living alone for perhaps a few too many years. The morning air carried the promise of rain, not today, but soon, and that was exactly what his prize morels needed. His garden, unlike the neat rows and squares that marked most Hobbit plots, sprawled in carefully planned chaos. Dark corners here, dappled shade there, each space cultivated for its particular fungi. The other hobbits of Willowmere tolerated what they called his peculiar occupation, primarily because his mushrooms had become the secret ingredient in just about every important dish served at any gathering worth attending. That, and he was a mossroot. His family had lived in that finner, cosy burrow since before anyone could remember. And in Willowmere, that counted for something. Orlen was checking the moisture levels in his logs when he heard the unmistakable sound of hurrying hobbit feet on the garden path. Young Sam Brownlock appeared around the corner, nearly tripping over his own hairy feet in his haste. "Mr. Mossroot, sir, I'm not late, am I? Only my sister's baby was crying all night, and then Ma needed help with the morning bread, and—" "Peace, lad." Orlen raised a dirt-stained hand, hiding his amusement. "The mushrooms haven't noticed your tardiness, though they do appreciate punctuality." He paused, noting the unusual flush in his apprentice's cheeks that couldn't be explained by his rush up the hill. "Though I suspect you've been somewhere else before coming here." Finn's ears turned pink, a sure tell if ever there was one. That is, I might have passed by the Bramblefoot place, on my way, which isn't really on my way at all, now that I think on it." "Ah." Orlen turned back to his logs, ignoring the sharp little pain in his chest at the mention. "And how is young Miss Marigold this morning?" "Beautiful as ever," Finn sighed, then caught himself. Well, that is, she was hanging out the wash. We only spoke for a moment." Orlen nodded sagely, remembering another young hobbit watching another Bramblefoot lass hanging out the wash. But that had been long ago, and some paths, once left untaken, gathered more than mushrooms in their shade. "Well then," he said briskly, "let's see if you remember what I taught you about the proper way to harvest morels. We've got the Brownleaf birthday celebration coming up. Mrs. Brownleaf specifically requested them for her son's coming-of-age feast." As he guided Finn through the delicate process of harvesting, Orlen couldn't help but notice how the lad's eyes kept drifting toward the path that led to the Bramblefoot's home. Young love was like a mushroom spore, he mused. It could take root in the most unlikely places, and once it did, there was no predicting what might grow from it. He was so lost in these thoughts that he almost missed Finn's next words. "Mr. Mossroot, did you hear about the visitor coming from Mickle Delving?" "Visitor?" Orlen's hand stilled on a particularly fine morel. "What visitor?" "Some fancy hobbit from a big trading family. They say—" Finn hesitated, then rushed on. "They say Mrs. Bramblefoot invited him special-like, on account of Miss Marigold being of age now." The morel came away in Orlen's hand, perfectly harvested despite his suddenly trembling fingers. He looked up at the willow trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. "Ah," he said again, and for the first time in years thought of the small box of poetry hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his study. "Well then," We'd best make sure these mushrooms are perfect. Can't have Willowmere's reputation suffering in front of mickle delving folk, can we? Finn nodded miserably. Orlen pretended not to notice the softening at the corners of the young hobbit's eyes. After all, what could he possibly say? Love and duty were like different varieties of mushroom. They both had their season, and sometimes, no matter how carefully you tended them, one had to give way to the other. But as he watched Finn return to his work with less than his usual enthusiasm, Orlen couldn't help but wonder if perhaps some seasons could be changed with the right kind of care. The afternoon sun had chased away the morning mist when Orlen finally shooed Finn home with a basket of lesser mushrooms for his family's table. The lad had been distracted all morning, twice nearly stepping on a patch of precious pine caps, his mind clearly wandering to gardens that grew flowers rather than mushrooms. Orlen was just settling down for his afternoon tea. A proper hobbit never skips afternoon tea, no matter their troubles, when a sharp knock at his door nearly caused him to drop his favourite honeycomb-patterned teacup. He frowned. Everyone in Willowmere knew better than to interrupt afternoon tea unless it was an emergency. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a familiar voice that made his heart skip like a young hobbit's. "Orlen Mossroot, I know you're in there. Your kettle's smoking." Rose Bramblefoot. Orlen looked down at his comfortable old waistcoat, spotted with dirt from the morning's work, and ran a nervous hand through his curly hair. Not that it mattered what he looked like, of course. They were old friends, nothing more, never more. He opened the door to find Rose standing there, her silver-streaked brown hair escaping its pins in the way it always had, even when they were young. She clutched a letter in her hand, the fine cream-coloured paper marking it as something decidedly not from Willowmere. "Well?" she said, arching an eyebrow. "Are you going to invite me in, or shall we discuss private matters on your doorstep where old Bilberry Thistlewool can add her own observations from her window?" Orlen glanced across the way to see their elderly neighbour hastily dropping her curtain back into place. "Please, come in. I was just about to pour the tea." A lie, but a polite one. Rose swept past him into his living room, and Orlen caught the faintest whiff of lavender. She still grew it by her kitchen window then. He followed her into his sitting room, suddenly aware of the scattered papers covered in his handwriting that lay near his favourite armchair. He casually dropped a book on top of them as he passed. "Your place hasn't changed a bit," Rose said, settling into the chair across from his. "Still the same old maps on the walls, same books everywhere." She paused, her eyes softening. "Remember how we used to sit here and read tales of elves and adventures when we were young?" "Your father said I was putting ideas in your head," Orlen replied, pouring tea with only slightly shaking hands. "As I recall, he preferred you spend time with hobbits who had more sensible interests." "Like Harold Proudfoot," Rose said quietly, "who gave me a perfectly lovely life and then left me a widow with a daughter to raise." She smoothed the letter in her lap. "Which is why I'm here, Orlen." He handed her a cup of tea, trying not to let their fingers brush. "The visitor from Mickle Delving. Finn mentioned something about it this morning." "Bertram Goldworthy," Rose said, and even the name sounded wealthy. "His family owns half the trading routes between here and Bree. He's looking for a wife." Orlen nearly choked on his tea. "But he must be at least 60. 58, Rose corrected. "And very well established. He's written to inquire about Marigold." She held up the letter. "He'll be here for the Harvest Moon Festival. If all goes well." She trailed off, staring into her teacup as if seeking answers in the leaves. "And what does Marigold think of this?" Orlen asked carefully, thinking of Finn's miserable face that morning. She's young. She doesn't understand yet that love isn't just about feelings. Rose's voice hardened slightly. Sometimes it's about doing what's best for your family. Surely you, of all people, understand that, Orlen. The words hung in the air between them like morning mist, heavy with unspoken meanings. Orlen stood and walked to his window, ostensibly to check on his mushroom beds. In reality, he needed a moment to compose himself. "Why are you really here, Rose?" he asked finally, still looking out at his garden. He heard her sigh behind him. "Because you're the most respected hobbit in Willowmere, even with your odd mushrooms and your books, because if you support this match at the festival, others will too. And because—" she hesitated. "Because you're my oldest friend, and I need your help." Orlen turned back to face her, and for a moment, he saw the young lass who used to sit in his garden, dreaming of adventures they'd never have. But that was long ago, and they had both chosen different paths. "Of course I'll help," he heard himself say, even as his heart ached for Finn and young Marigold. "What are friends for?" Rose smiled, relief evident on her face, but her eyes were bright with what might have been tears. She stood smoothing her skirts. "Thank you, Orlen. I knew I could count on you." She moved toward the door, then paused. "You will come to dinner tomorrow night, won't you, to meet Bertram when he arrives?" Orlen nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After she left, he went to his study and pulled up the loose floorboard, taking out a small box filled with poems he'd written over the years but never shared. "Love isn't just about feelings," she'd said. Opening the box, he wondered if perhaps that was the problem. Sometimes it was about having the courage to act on them. The next evening found Orlen standing before his mirror, fidgeting with his best waistcoat, a handsome piece in deep green velvet with brass buttons that he saved for special occasions. He had even attempted to tame his unruly hair, though the curls remained as stubborn as their owner. A noise from his garden drew him to the window. Young Finn was there in the twilight, tending to the mushrooms as he'd been taught, but Orlen could tell his heart wasn't in it. The lad had been silent all day, going about his tasks with none of his usual cheerful chatter. "Finn," Orlen called softly, "come inside for a moment." The young hobbit looked up, surprised, then trudged to the door. When he entered, his eyes widened at the sight of Orlen's formal attire. "So it's true then," Finn said quietly. "You're going to the Bramblefoots to meet him." "I am." Orlen moved to his pantry and brought out a small covered basket. "Which is why I need you to make a special delivery for me. These are Mrs. Bramblefoot's favourite, winter chanterelles. They're particularly fine this year." He pressed the basket into Finn's hands. "They should be delivered right away, don't you think? Through the kitchen door, perhaps?" Finn's eyes lit up with understanding. The kitchen door was right beneath Marigold's window. "But Mr. Mossroot, won't you be bringing these yourself? You're going there anyway." "Am I? Dear me, I seem to have forgotten these completely. And I'm already running late. What a fortunate thing that I have such a reliable apprentice." Orlen adjusted his waistcoat again. "Get a step on it, if you don't mind, Finn. But remember, mushrooms are delicate things. They require careful handling." Finn clutched the basket, hope brightening his face. "Yes, sir. Very delicate. I'll be ever so careful." After Finn departed, Orlen took the path that led to the Bramblefoot's burrow. The evening was perfect. Stars were just beginning to peek through the purple dusk, and the air was sweet with the scent of late summer flowers. As he approached, he could see extra lanterns had been lit along the garden path, their warm light spilling across carefully tended flower beds. He heard the clip-clop of pony hooves before he saw the cart coming up the main road, a fine vehicle with polished wooden wheels and brass fittings that gleamed in the lantern light. It could only be Mr. Goldworthy. The cart came to a stop and a hobbit stepped down, assisted by a servant. Bertram was exactly as Orlen had imagined him, prosperous-looking in a wine-coloured jacket with gold buttons, his grey streaked hair neatly combed, his bearing that of someone used to being listened to. He was also, Orlen noted with a slight frown, old enough to be Marigold's father. "Ah, you must be Master Mossroot," Goldworthy called out, striding forward with his hand extended. "I've heard all about your famous mushrooms. They say no proper meal in Willowmere is complete without them." "You're too kind," Orlen replied, shaking the offered hand. "Though I suspect tonight's meal will have many other charms to recommend it." Goldworthy's laugh was hearty but practiced. "I must say I'm quite looking forward to meeting young Miss Bramblefoot. They say she's the prettiest lass in Willowmere." Before Orlen could respond, the front door opened, spilling warm light onto the path. Rose stood there, lovely in a blue dress Orlen remembered from past celebrations. Behind her stood Marigold, and Orlen's heart sank at the sight of her face. She was beautiful, yes, but her eyes held the look of a trapped rabbit. "Welcome, welcome!" Rose called out. "Please, come in. Dinner is nearly ready." As they moved toward the door, Orlen caught a glimpse of movement near the kitchen entrance, a flash of Finn's brown jacket as he made his delivery. Marigold must have seen it too, for her cheeks coloured slightly and her hands clasped together. Inside, the dining room had been set with the best dishes and linens. Rose had clearly gone to considerable effort, though Orlen noted that the centerpiece still featured her signature wildflowers rather than more formal blooms. Some things, at least, hadn't changed. "I hope you don't mind, Master Goldworthy," Rose was saying, "but I've asked my old friend Orlen to join us. He's been such a help to us since Harold passed." "Not at all, not at all," Goldworthy boomed. "The more the merrier. And please, call me Bertram." He turned to Marigold, who had been quietly arranging herself in her chair. "Though I must say the tales of your beauty did not do you justice, my dear." Marigold murmured something appropriate, but kept her eyes on her plate. As Rose bustled about with the serving, Orlen noticed a small white flower had been tucked into Marigold's hair, a winter chanterelle blossom. His heart ached for the young lovers, even as he wondered if he was doing the right thing by helping them. The dinner conversation flowed like a stream around rocks, pleasant on the surface but turbulent underneath. Goldworthy spoke at length about his business dealings, his properties, and his plans for expansion. Rose asked all the right questions. Marigold remained quiet but polite, and Orlen watched and listened and thought about courage and choices and love. Just as the dessert course was being served, a crash from the kitchen caused everyone at the table to jump. Rose leaped to her feet, but before she could move, the kitchen door burst open and a very flustered Poppy Brownlock, Finn's mother, rushed in. "Oh, begging your pardon, Mrs. Bramblefoot," she exclaimed, wringing her apron, "but there's been a terrible accident with the mushrooms." Orlen's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected Finn's mother to become involved in whatever his apprentice was planning. "Mushrooms?" Rose asked, clearly flustered by the interruption. "What mushrooms?" Why, the special ones Master Mossroot sent over with Finn for the dinner. They were meant to be for the dessert sauce, weren't they? Only Finn's gone and dropped them all, and now he's out there nearly in tears about ruining everything. Poppy's performance was remarkably convincing, though Orlen noticed a familiar glint in her eye that reminded him she'd once been quite the troublemaker in her youth. Marigold's head snapped up, a flash of worry crossing her face. "I sent no mushrooms for dessert," Orlen said carefully, then added, "though I did send some winter chanterelles over with Finn earlier. For tomorrow's breakfast, I thought." Rose looked confused. "But I received no—" "Perhaps," Marigold spoke up suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. "I should go help Finn clean up the mess. It's partly my fault. I startled him when I was getting water from the pump." Bertram Goldworthy, who had been watching this exchange with mild amusement, waved a gracious hand. "My dear girl, don't trouble yourself. Let the servants handle such matters." "Oh, but we don't stand on such ceremony here in Willowmere," Orlen interjected smoothly. "We all help where we're needed. It's our way." "Indeed," said Marigold, already rising from her chair. "Mother, please continue enjoying your dessert. I'll make sure everything's properly sorted." Before anyone could object, she had slipped through the kitchen door. Poppy, after a quick curtsy, followed her out. Rose looked mortified. "You'll have to forgive us, Bertram. This is most irregular." "Nonsense," Goldworthy laughed, though Orlen noted it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I find these little local customs quite charming, though I must say, when we're settled in Mickle Delving, we'll have proper staff to handle such matters." He patted his lips with a napkin. "Speaking of which, my dear Rose, shall we discuss the arrangements while we have a moment?" Orlen's hand tightened on his spoon. "Arrangements? Why, yes," Goldworthy continued, seemingly oblivious to the shock in Orlen's tone. "I've taken the liberty of having my solicitor draw up some preliminary papers. Nothing binding, of course, but it's best to have these things properly organized." He reached into his jacket and pulled out several folded documents. "You see, I propose a very generous settlement." A loud clatter of pots from the kitchen interrupted him. Rose jumped again, looking increasingly distressed. "Perhaps," Orlen suggested, standing up, "I should check on the situation." As he approached the kitchen door, his heart was hammering. In truth, he had no idea what he might find. Young love could be as unpredictable as spring weather. The scene in the kitchen was not quite what he expected. The kitchen was spotless. There wasn't a single mushroom, spilled or otherwise, in sight. Instead, Orlen found Marigold and Finn huddled near the back door, heads bent together over what appeared to be a letter, while Poppy Brownlock stood guard at the other door, her ear pressed against it. "They're still talking about papers," Poppy whispered. "That Goldworthy fellow does love the sound of his own voice, doesn't he?" "Mrs. Brownlock," Orlen said carefully, "I don't recall you being invited to dinner this evening." Poppy straightened up, smoothing her apron. "Well, when my Finn came home in such a state about those mushrooms you sent him to deliver, which we both know you didn't, Master Mossroot, I thought to myself, that boy needs his mother's help, though I must say I didn't expect to be dragged into quite such a drama." Her stern expression softened. "But then, love makes fools of us all, doesn't it?" Finn and Marigold jumped apart guiltily, but Orlen had already seen the letter in Marigold's hands, written in Finn's careful script by the look of it. "Mr. Mossroot," Finn started, "I can explain." "I should hope so," Orlen replied, trying to sound stern despite the smile tugging at his lips. involving your mother in such schemes, and here I thought I'd taught you to be more subtle in your gardening. Marigold stepped forward, her chin raised. It's my fault, Mr. Mossroot. Finn wanted to tell Mother and Mr. Goldworthy properly, but She faltered, then squared her shoulders. I was afraid. Mother's been so worried about money since Father died, and Mr. Goldworthy is so wealthy, and I thought perhaps I could learn to bear it. But then Finn brought your mushrooms, and there was his letter, and she held up the pages in her hand. He's written the most beautiful things, about how the flowers bloom brighter when I'm near, and how he'd work his whole life to make me happy, even if we never had more than a small garden and a cozy little home. Which is all very romantic, Poppy interjected practically, but won't pay the mortgage on the Bramblefoot place, will it? Actually, Finn said, pulling himself up to his full height, which being a hobbit wasn't very much. I've been saving everything I've earned from Mr. Mossroot and from selling vegetables at the market, and I've been studying more than just mushrooms. He glanced at Orlen. I've learned about trade, about what grows best and sells best. I've even started corresponding with farmers in Bree. Orlen blinked in surprise. He'd noticed Finn taking notes during their lessons, but hadn't realized the extent of the lad's ambitions. Is that so? He said thoughtfully. And would these correspondences have anything to do with those new varieties of mushroom you asked me about last month? The ones that fetch such good prices in Bree? Finn nodded eagerly. They're willing to pay 3 times what we get here, and with your methods, Mr. Mossroot, we could grow them better than anyone. If you'd be willing to take on a partner, a junior partner, he added hastily. Very junior. Before Orlen could respond, they heard chairs scraping in the dining room. Poppy rushed back to her post at the door. They're getting up. Rose is showing him to the study to review those papers. Marigold went pale. Oh no, once Mother signs anything? Orlen made a quick decision. Mrs. Brownlock, how would you like to create another small distraction? Something to delay them just a bit longer. He turned to Finn and Marigold. You two, in my study, under the loose floorboard by the window, there's a box. Bring it to Rose's study. Quickly now. As they rushed out the back door, Poppy gave Orlen a knowing look. The poetry box, is it? After all these years? You knew about that? She snorted. Of course I knew. Half of Willowmere knew how you felt about Rose. Well, except Rose herself. She straightened her apron again. Right then, one distraction coming up. I do hope you know what you're doing, Master Mossroot. So do I, Mrs. Brownlock. So do I. As Poppy burst back into the dining room, loudly proclaiming that smoke was coming from somewhere and had anyone checked the chimney, Orlen took a deep breath. He'd spent decades growing mushrooms in the dark, nurturing things that needed just the right conditions to flourish. Perhaps it was time to let some other things grow in the light. He stepped back into the dining room, where chaos was already unfolding. Rose's study was a small room lined with ledgers and family portraits, centered around a worn desk that had belonged to her father. When Orlen entered, Bertram Goldworthy was holding forth about investment opportunities in the Mickle delving market, while Rose stared at the papers before her, Quill hovering uncertainly over the signature line. Poppy's shouts about chimney smoke still echoed from the dining room, accompanied by the sound of furniture being hastily moved. Rose looked up gratefully at Orlen's entrance. Perhaps we should check on, she began, but Goldworthy waved a dismissive hand. Your servants seem to have it well in hand, he said. Now, as I was saying about the terms, Orlen winced, knowing full well that Rose was too embarrassed to correct Bertram. since they had no servants. "I don't believe," Orlen said quietly, "that Rose should sign anything tonight." Both Rose and Goldworthy snapped their heads up to stare at him. In the silence that followed, they could hear the soft patter of hobbit feet rushing up the garden path. "My good fellow," Goldworthy said, his jovial manner slipping slightly, "this is hardly any of your concern. This is a private family matter between myself, the lovely Mrs. Bramblefoot, and her daughter." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong." Orlen moved further into the room, his heart thundering in his chest. "You see, I've spent my life growing things in the dark. Mushrooms need just the right conditions. Patience, care, and most importantly, timing. But I've learned recently that some things shouldn't be kept in the dark at all." Rose's eyes widened. The door burst open, and Finn and Marigold tumbled in, clutching Orlen's wooden box. They were breathing hard from their run, and Marigold's hair had come loose from its pins, the winter chanterelle blossom still tucked behind her ear. "Mother?" Marigold said before anyone could speak. "I cannot marry Mr. Goldworthy. My heart belongs to Finn." "This is absurd," Goldworthy sputtered. "Mrs. Bramblefoot, surely you won't allow this gardener's boy to—" "He's more than that," Orlen interrupted. "Finn, show her the letters from Bree." Finn pulled several much-folded papers from his pocket, hands shaking slightly as he laid them on Rose's desk. "I've been learning, Mrs. Bramblefoot, not just about mushrooms, but about trade, about making a proper living. Mr. Mossroot has offered me a partnership, and with these contracts from Bree—" He swallowed hard. "I may not have fine carriages or grand houses, but I can promise to keep a roof over Marigold's head and food on her table. And more importantly, I promise to love her until the end of my days." Rose picked up the letters, her eyes scanning them quickly. "These prices, they are real?" "As real as the love I've kept hidden all these years," Orlen said softly, taking the wooden box from Marigold's hands. He opened it, revealing decades of carefully penned poems. "Rose, I should have shown you these long ago. Each one was written for you, about the way sunlight catches in your hair, about how your garden blooms more beautifully than any other, about the laugh you try to hide behind your hand when something truly amuses you." The room fell silent. Rose stared at the box of poems, her hands trembling slightly. "Well, this is all very touching," Goldworthy said acidly. "But we were in the middle of a business arrangement." "No," Rose said suddenly, pushing the contract away. "No, we weren't." She stood up, looking at her daughter. "Marigold, do you truly love him?" Marigold nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "With all my heart, Mother." Rose turned to Finn. "And you'll take care of her? Promise me." "Until my dying breath, Mrs. Bramblefoot." "Well then." Rose picked up the contract and, with a flourish, tore it in half. "I believe that concludes our business, Mr. Goldworthy." Bertram Goldworthy drew himself up to his full height, mustache quivering with indignation. "What is this nonsense? I have never been so insulted in all my—" "Oh, do be quiet," came Poppy's voice from the doorway, where she stood with several other curious neighbours who had apparently been drawn by the commotion. "Can't you see that we're in the middle of something important here?" After Goldworthy stormed out, Rose turned to Orlen, holding his box of poems. "All these years?" she whispered. "Every single one," he replied. "I was afraid of ruining our friendship, afraid of not being enough. But watching these two, he gestured to Finn and Marigold, who stood hand in hand, I realized that some kinds of love are worth being brave for. Rose opened the box and pulled out a piece of paper at random. As she read, a smile spread out across her face. The real one, not her polite social one. Then, to everyone's surprise, she laughed that laugh she always tried to hide behind her hand. "You ridiculous hobbit," she said fondly. "Do you know how long I waited for you to say something? Any little hint?" What? Why do you think I spent so much time in your garden all those years ago? I wasn't there for the mushrooms all in moss root. And then, to the delight of their impromptu audience, Rose stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was well past proper visiting hours when the last of the neighbours finally departed Rose's study, though not before Poppy Brownlock had somehow managed to serve everyone tea and seed cakes that she'd apparently just happened to have ready. The timing of their appearance suggested she'd been rather confident about how events would unfold. Now, in the quiet of the late evening, Rose and Orlen sat in her garden, while Finn and Marigold walked among the flower beds, their heads close together as they whispered their own plans and promises. The quarter moon hung above the willows like a hopeful smile. "You do realize," Rose said, carefully turning one of Orlen's poems in her hands, "that half of Willowmere will be scandalized by all this." "Only half?" Orlen raised an eyebrow. "I would have thought at least 3/4. We're slipping in our ability to shock." Rose laughed, and Orlen felt his heart soar at the sound. Breaking a marriage contract with a wealthy Mickle delving merchant, 2 love confessions in one night, and Mrs. Brownlock orchestrating the whole thing like a theatre production. It's hardly proper hobbit behaviour. Since when have the Bramblefoots or the Moss Roots cared much for proper? Orlen gestured to where Finn was now showing Marigold how the moonflowers were opening. "Though speaking of proper, we should discuss their situation." Rose nodded, her expression growing serious. "The contracts from Bree are promising, but it will take time for that business to grow. And the mortgage? I've been thinking about that." Orlen pulled out a carefully folded paper from his waistcoat pocket. "If we combined Finn's new mushroom trade with my existing business, and perhaps expand the growing fields into that fallow patch behind your garden." He hesitated. "That is, if you wouldn't mind your garden sharing a border with my mushroom beds." Rose's eyes widened as she caught his meaning. "Orlen Mossroot, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "Well," he said carefully, "it would be the sensible thing, wouldn't it? Combining our properties, I mean, for the children's sake, of course. And the mushrooms." "For the mushrooms? Of course." Rose's eyes twinkled. "And I suppose you'll be wanting to move your books into my study. For efficiency's sake. Only if you'll let me plant some moonflowers by your window. They bloom best in pairs, you know." Their quiet laughter drew Finn and Marigold back to the garden bench. The young couple looked nervous but determined. "Mother?" Marigold started. "Finn and I have been talking." "I should hope so," Rose interrupted with a smile. "Otherwise, this has been a very eventful evening for nothing." "We'd like to announce our engagement at the Harvest Moon Festival," Finn said in a rush. If that's acceptable?" Rose and Orlen exchanged glances. "The festival is only 3 weeks away," Rose said carefully. "People will talk." "Let them," Marigold replied with unexpected firmness. "I'm tired of hiding how I feel." Orlen felt Rose's hand slip into his and squeeze gently. "As am I," she said softly. But before anyone could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats on the main road. A pony cart clattered past Rose's garden gate, and in the moonlight they could clearly see Bertram Goldworthy sitting with another hobbit, one whose family was known for their influence in Willowmere's town council. "Well," said Orlen, watching the cart disappear around the bend, "it seems the Harvest Moon Festival might be more eventful than usual this year." Rose squeezed his hand again. "Good thing we have 3 weeks to prepare." As they sat there in the moonlit garden, surrounded by the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers mixing with the earthy smell of mushroom beds, Orlen thought about how love was like his precious morals. It could take years to create the right conditions for growth, but once it took root, it could flourish in the most unexpected ways. He just hoped they were all ready for whatever harvest the coming weeks would bring. If there was one thing hobbits excelled at beyond cooking and gardening, it was the rapid spread of gossip. By the time the sun rose the morning after Bertram Goldworthy's hasty departure, it seemed every hobbit in Willowmere had their own version of events to share over their first breakfast. "I heard," said Mrs. Bilberry Thistlewool to anyone who would listen as she arranged her scones at the market stall, "that young Sam Brownlock burst into the study wielding a gardening trowel and declared he'd rather live as a wild man in the old forest than see Miss Marigold married off to that pompous mickle-delving fellow." "Nonsense," replied her neighbour Mrs. Puddifoot, while selecting the plumpest scone. "My cousin's wife's sister was there, and she says Master Mossroot challenged Mr. Goldworthy to a duel with mushroom spores. Quite dangerous, apparently." The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between the wild tales and morning gossip. But for Orlen, waking up in his cosy bed that morning, the most unbelievable part was that it had happened at all. He stood at his kitchen window, cup of tea in hand, watching the early morning mist curl around his mushroom beds. The wooden box of poems sat open on his table, one piece of parchment pulled out and unfolded, the very first poem he'd written for Rose, decades ago. A knock at his door interrupted his daydream. He opened it to find Finn looking simultaneously exhausted and radiant. "Mr. Mossroot, I hope I'm not too early, only I couldn't sleep, and I've been thinking about the brie contracts, and I've had some ideas about expanding the growing beds, and—" "Finn," Orlen interrupted gently, "have you had breakfast?" "Oh, well, no, I was too excited to—" "Then come in, lad, and sit down. No good ideas ever came from an empty stomach. That's the first rule of being a proper businessman." As Orlen busied himself with second breakfast preparations, for he'd already had first breakfast, being a respectable hobbit, Finn fidgeted at the table, practically buzzing with nervous energy. "Mr. Mossroot," he began again, "about last night, I never properly thanked you for—" "The mushrooms," Orlen suggested mildly, setting down a plate of eggs and bacon. "Yes, that was quite clever of you, using them as an excuse to deliver your letter." Finn blushed. "Actually, I meant for standing up to Mr. Goldworthy, and for offering the partnership. I promise I won't let you down." "I know you won't." Orlen sat down across from him. "But we have some challenges ahead. Mr. Goldworthy isn't the type to take rejection lightly, and that was Councillor Bracklebury's cart he was riding in last night." Finn's face fell slightly. "Do you think they'll make trouble?" "Let's just say that getting approval for expanding our growing fields might be more complicated than we'd hoped." Orlen took a sip of tea. "And then there's the matter of the festival preparations." Before he could continue, another knock came at the door. This one more urgent. Orlen opened it to find Marigold standing there, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Mossroot, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mother's just received a letter. The Goldworthys are calling in their loans, all of them. They're demanding payment in full by the end of the month." Finn jumped up from the table. "But that's impossible. No one could raise that much money so quickly. Unless, said a new voice, and they turned to see Rose standing in the doorway, holding a thick stack of papers. That was their plan all along. The marriage contract wasn't just about Marigold. Bertram Goldworthy has been buying up all our old debts. He now holds every mortgage and loan in Willowmere. She stepped into the kitchen, and Orlen had never seen her look so worried. And it's not just us. The Puddyfoots, the Thistlewools, even the Brownlocks. He owns them all. Orlen felt his heart sink. One rejected suitor they could handle. But this was something else entirely. He looked around his kitchen at their worried faces and realized that their story had suddenly become much bigger than a simple tale of romance. "Well," he said finally, reaching for his hat, "I believe it's time we paid a visit to the Sleepy Acorn Inn. If Goldworthy wants to take on Willowmere, he's about to learn that hobbits are rather like mushrooms. We might seem soft, but we're surprisingly resilient when we grow together." The Sleepy Acorn Inn had stood at the heart of Willowmere since before anyone could remember. Unlike its more famous namesake in Bywater, it was a modest establishment, but what it lacked in size it made up for in comfort. On this particular morning, it was unusually busy for the hour, filled with hobbits speaking in hushed, worried tones over their morning ales. As Orlen entered with Rose Finn and Marigold, conversations stuttered to a halt. Then, like a dam breaking, everyone started speaking at once. "Master Mossroot, did you hear? Rose, my dear, is it true about the loans? Young Finn, your father's looking for you." "Quiet!" The booming voice belonged to old Gil Broadbelt, the innkeeper, whose remarkable girth was matched only by his capacity for maintaining order in his establishment. "Let them at least get settled before you pester them half to death, you blithering fools." He guided them to a corner table, the best one, with worn but comfortable chairs and a view of both the hearth and the door. As they sat down, Orlen noticed that many of Willowmere's most prominent families were present. The Puddyfoots huddled near the window, the Thistlewools by the bar, and in the opposite corner, looking particularly grim, sat Finn's father, Fisk Brownlock, with several other farmers. "I took the liberty," old Gil said, setting down a pot of tea, for it was still too early for proper drinking, even by Hobbit standards, of sending young Perry Kettleback to fetch a few others, including, he added with a meaningful look at Rose, "your brother from the archives." Rose brightened considerably. "Fosco's coming, but he never leaves the archives." "Desperate times," Jill replied sagely, then lowered his voice. "Is it true what they're saying about the Goldworthys buying up all the debts?" "I'm afraid so," Orlen said, pulling out the papers Rose had brought. "And there's more. Their cart was seen last night with Councillor Bracklebury. That old badger. He's been trying to change the land use laws for years. Wants to turn half our farming fields into trading posts for big folk caravans. Which would be disastrous for the mushroom trade," Finn added, showing a grasp of economics that made Orlen proud. The shade from those big buildings would ruin the growing conditions, and the traffic would compact the soil. The door opened, letting in a shaft of late-morning sunlight along with several more hobbits. Among them was a thin, scholarly-looking fellow with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched precariously on his nose, Fosco Bramblefoot, Rose's younger brother and keeper of Willowmere's archives. "Rose!" he called out, hurrying over while clutching a stack of ancient-looking documents. "I came as soon as I got the message. I think I might have found something." He was interrupted by another arrival, Councillor Bracklebury himself, looking rather pleased with himself as he strutted into the inn. "Well, well," he said, surveying the gathered hobbits with barely concealed satisfaction. "Quite a gathering for this hour. One might almost think you were up to something." Old Gil replied innocently. "In my establishment? Why, we're just having a friendly morning chat. Perhaps you'd care to join us. I believe Mr. Goldworthy's business dealings have become quite the topic of conversation." Brackleberry's smile tightened. "Yes, I suppose they have. Such a shame about all those loans coming due. Still, business is business. Though," he paused for effect, "I hear Mr. Goldworthy might be open to alternative arrangements for those willing to be reasonable about certain proposed changes to our land use regulations." An angry murmur ran through the crowd. Orlen felt Rose's hand slip into his under the table, squeezing tightly. "Interesting timing," came Fosco's quiet voice, and all heads turned to him. He was leafing through his documents, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. "Very interesting indeed. You see, I've been reviewing the original land grants for Willowmere, the ones signed by the Thayan himself, 200 years ago." He looked up, and there was a glint in his eye that reminded Orlen very much of his sister. "Did you know that there's a clause about collective land rights? Most fascinating thing, especially the bit about how the community must vote as a whole on any significant changes to land use." He blinked owlishly at Brackleberry. "I don't suppose Mr. Goldworthy is aware." The councillor's face had gone an interesting shade of purple. "Those are ancient documents, surely not still binding." "Oh, but they are," Fosco continued cheerfully, "renewed and signed by every Thayan since, including the current one. I have all the papers right here. Would you like to see them?" Before Brackleberry could respond, the door burst open once again. This time it was young Perry Kettleback, out of breath and excited. "The post rider," he gasped. "Just came through from Bree. You'll never believe what he told me about Mr. Goldworthy's last business venture there." All eyes turned to Perry, who was still catching his breath by the door. Even Councillor Brackleberry seemed unable to maintain his usual air of smug superiority in the face of this interruption. "Well?" Old Gil prompted, pulling out a chair for the exhausted young hobbit. "What did he say, boy?" "It's not just us," Perry managed between gulps of air. "Goldworthy tried the same thing in Bree last spring, buying up debts, pressuring the council to change laws about building heights and trading routes. But it all fell apart when the Bree folk discovered that his trading company was nearly bankrupt," came a new voice from the door. There stood Poppy Brownlock, looking rather pleased with herself. "Oh yes, I've been writing to my cousin in Bree all morning. Seems Mr. Goldworthy has been trying to save his failing business by taking over smaller communities. Bree was too big for him to handle, but Willowmere—" She let the implication hang in the air. Councillor Brackleberry had gone from purple to pale. "These are baseless rumours. Mr. Goldworthy is a highly respected—" "Desperate man," Fosco interrupted, still studying his documents, "who, if I'm reading these properly, has just invested a great deal of money in buying debts he can't actually collect on, not if these land rights laws are enforced." He looked up at his sister. "Which is probably why he was so keen on marrying into a respected Willowmere family. Needed local support, I'd imagine." Rose stood up slowly, and Orlen noticed she had that look in her eye, the one that reminded him of the time she'd faced down a wolf threatening her prized sheep. "So," she said quietly, "Mr. Goldworthy thought he could pressure us into selling out our community by threatening our homes? Well, he's about to learn something about hobbits of Willowmere." "We take care of our own," Old Gil agreed, nodding firmly. "But the debts," Finn's father spoke up from his corner. They're still real, even if Goldworthy's scheme isn't. How can we possibly raise it enough to pay them off by the end of the month? Actually, Finn said, pulling out his carefully kept notebooks, I might have an idea about that. Mr. Mossroot and I have been working on those new mushroom varieties, the ones that sell for such high prices in Bree. Well, what if we didn't just sell to Bree? Orlen caught on immediately. The Harvest Moon Festival, he said, growing excited. We always get traders from all over the Shire and beyond, if we could show them our new varieties. And not just mushrooms, Marigold added, standing up beside Finn. We all have something to offer. The Puddifoot's famous pies, the Thistlewool's wool crafts, Mother's preserves. A proper market fair, Rose nodded. Something to show everyone what Willowmere can do. But that's less than 3 weeks away, Bracklebury protested, though he was starting to look distinctly uncomfortable. You can't possibly organise. Watch us, said Poppy Brownlock firmly. We're hobbits. Give us a party to plan and a problem to solve, and you'd be amazed what we can do. The room erupted in excited chatter as ideas began flowing freely, while Fosco spread his documents across a table, explaining the legal protections to anyone who would listen. In the midst of it all, Orlen felt Rose slip her hand into his again. You know what this means, don't you? She whispered. That we have a lot of work ahead of us. That too. But I meant... She smiled that secret smile he'd loved for so long. We might have to postpone any thoughts of quieter celebrations, personal ones. Orlen squeezed her hand. I've waited quite some time already. What's a few more weeks? He added with a twinkle in his eye. I do have a new variety of wedding mushroom I've been cultivating, just in case. But before Rose could respond, they were pulled into the growing excitement of planning. There were committees to join, letters to write, and a festival to organise. And somewhere in Mickle Delving, Bertram Goldworthy had no idea what was coming his way. The next few days in Willowmere saw more activity than the sleepy Hobbit settlement had experienced in generations. Everybody buzzed with purpose, every garden and workshop transformed into a centre of industrious preparation. The air itself seemed charged with determination, and, occasionally, with the distinct smell of experimental mushroom cultivation. In Orlen's garden, the usual peace of his mushroom beds had given way to organised chaos. Finn had taken charge of expanding their growing operation with remarkable efficiency, directing a small army of volunteer hobbits in the careful preparation of new beds. Careful with those spores, he called out to young Perry Kettleback, who was helping transport the precious new varieties. They need to be kept at just the right temperature. Orlen watched from his kitchen window, torn between pride in his apprentice's leadership and anxiety over so many feet tromping around his carefully tended plots. Rose, who had taken to spending her mornings with him, causing no small amount of gossip despite their advanced years, noticed his concern. They're doing fine, she assured him, setting a fresh cup of tea at his elbow. Though I must say I've never seen Master Puddifoot so invested in mushroom cultivation. Wasn't he the one who called it that peculiar dirt poking at last year's harvest festival? Amazing how the threat of losing one's home can change one's perspective on dirt poking, Orlen replied dryly. He turned to face her, his expression growing serious. Have you heard anything more from Mickle Delving? Rose's smile faded slightly. Fosco received another letter this morning. Goldworthy's lawyers are contesting the land rights laws. They're claiming they only apply to agricultural land, not to trading posts. She sighed. And there's something else. The festival commissioners are being difficult about our expanded market fair plans. Let me guess. Councillor Bracklebury's influence. Most likely. They're saying we need special permits for trading with outsiders, permits that could take months to approve. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Marigold, looking worried but determined. "Mr. Mossroot, Mother, you need to come to the square. Well, you should just come see." They followed her into the village centre where a small crowd had gathered. In the middle of the square stood a large wagon, and beside it, looking extremely pleased with himself, was Bertram Goldworthy. End of Act 1.